Okay, good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Thanks for joining the Connect Secure weekly call. Um, we have some interesting discussions around the new agent architecture that Shiva is going to take us through, plus some regular product updates. So over to you, Shiva, and we can get started.
Yeah, thanks, Srikanth. So, good morning, everyone. So, folks, I'm going to go through the product updates, and I've received quite a few mails from a lot of you in terms of wanting to access the new UI and new website. My team is working hard on it and will essentially kind of provide a location where we are basically going to kind of set up a real world environment, which is we're going to basically take our lab and expose it to the world so that you can essentially kind of have a read-only view of the environment. You can look at all the features. So we are actually setting up an isolated lab which can do that, so that you can experience everything from Active Directory and basically create all the data so that when you see the report in the format that we essentially presented, and when you issue commands, etc., it actually works, and it's not something that you basically say, okay, I'm not getting a full hang of the whole piece. So bear with us as we basically push through that particular piece, and I will basically keep you updated on the status of that. As far as basically updates, one of the things that we got from quite a few, actually almost like 7 or 8 partners, is that the ability to essentially kind of migrate settings from one probe to the other for whatever reason. Basically, you replaced a probe, or you lost a machine, or you essentially just want to basically kind of have 2 probes and basically duplicate the settings across the 2 probes. So right now we have the ability to essentially copy all the settings across the probe, and this was basically kind of delivered. It's there in your instances today. So this includes all of the settings, so you can essentially copy any of the settings that you want across all of these pieces. The second thing is that one of the also request was basically to be able to filter the entire set of assets based on the status of the asset, whether it's online or offline, and that also has been essentially been given to all of you. Third is essentially like in the ConnectWise integration, which is being used by a lot of folks. One of the things that we were not doing is basically mapping alerts to a specific site, and now essentially you have the ability to map alerts to a specific site, and that is also being released right now. And the other thing is that when you map a particular site, even when you basically do this, create a ticket from basically the network, from the network vulnerability view or the remediation view, you essentially get it mapped to a particular site. So this is essentially one of the other features. Of course, basically in our endeavor to essentially make sure that all data is available, and this thing, we basically keep producing these new reports. And this is essentially what we are trying to essentially kind of manage and basically get into that whole, the book UI that you saw last week, which is we keep creating all of these reports. And I think eventually after a point of time, everybody's going to look at it and say, okay, how do I basically deal with like these 50 reports or 100 reports? And that's where the whole concept of the new user interface comes into place. But right now we have global reports on critical internal vulnerabilities and network vulnerabilities. So this basically gives you a view across all the companies of all the vulnerabilities that are out there. And this is also there for the high vulnerabilities. So these are the formats of the critical vulnerabilities where it shows you all of the data in terms of base core, the company. And so you can essentially slice and dice and basically operate on all of those pieces. Okay. So this is as far as this. Second is that we have a network scan vulnerability report, which basically is a summary. So earlier we were providing the export of the complete network scan vulnerabilities, but here essentially you get a world report, so you can essentially use this, which shows you all of the things in terms of what is the CVS score, what is the recommendation, and all of those pieces basically right here. And then basically there's one report on the browser extensions, because of late, a lot of the malicious browser extensions are essentially moving around. And this essentially gives you the ability to look at all of the browser extensions and then kind of make sure that anything that you don't want is not there. In fact, one of the things when people showed me this was, I believed at least, then you can basically say whether it's useful or not, is to essentially say, like just as we have application baseline, we should have the ability to create what is called a plugin, a browser plugin baseline. And if certain browser plugins you want to ban, you should essentially be able to ban, so that you know that these malicious browser plugins are basically not logged into your customer environment, or your customer may want certain plugins to be locked because they don't want, for example, there are plugins on Chrome which essentially can take a screenshot. Now, today, if you want to basically remove that, you basically implement a lot of controls which cannot take screenshots, but the browser can effectively take screenshots, and then you basically have bypassed the whole security piece, right? So this can be used to essentially also do the baselining. And if you basically, if the team is okay, we can essentially introduce a baselining for these browser plugins also. We also have the detailed external scan vulnerability report, so that you can essentially kind of provide it. While we provide the PDF reports, we also have the ability to essentially kind of get the complete details of the whole thing. The next thing was essentially there are certain applications which essentially we get complete path information on where it is installed, and certain applications where you basically don't have the path information, because these are applications which basically do not essentially register on a particular path, and so we have to search on the file system. So we essentially have given you the ability to kind of get these particular applications and where it is located and what are the uninstalled strings over there. So we just separated that. So with that said, what have been so these are minor updates. One of the major things that I wanted to cover today is that what are we changing from an agent perspective? What are the things coming in? Why is it why is it taking time, and what is it that we are essentially doing? So this essentially is our current architecture, right? So I've kind of walked through this earlier. If you really look at it, basically our agents essentially talk to AWS Kinesis, which is the equivalent of Kafka, which is nothing but a queuing bus, which then basically talks to a serverless interface. And then from there, we essentially push the data into Redis and then into Kubernetes, and then it goes into Elasticsearch. And essentially, when you access the data, either using an API or this, basically we have a web application firewall, which basically is front-ending an entire Kubernetes cluster, which essentially is talking to the API. And that is essentially talking to Elasticsearch. Now, this is a simplified view. Inside this, there are multiple data pipelines which essentially run, which essentially kind of enrich the data, and that is mostly the view that you see. So for example, if I get the list of installed programs, based on the installed programs, I need to figure out what are the vulnerabilities in there, and those are essentially the part of the data pipelines that run within this entire scheme of things. Now, one of the things that I think you all have encountered and you all have noticed is basically like multiple times when things become very slow, unresponsive, and basically, and then we kind of did a root cause analysis of all that pieces. And we figured out that essentially this component, the Elasticsearch that we have, is one of the reasons for why we essentially are facing these huge performance issues. And Elasticsearch as a product is good, but the problem is that A, it is very resource hungry, and B, it is also one of the reasons for why Elasticsearch becomes a problem is because you cannot run certain types of queries. And third, what we realized is that when we chose Elasticsearch initially, it was because basically we believed that a lot of the people who are there in the in the security world would essentially all have the ability to create their own dashboards, etc. So we actually ran through the entire piece and looked at how many people actually created dashboards, etc. It was less than 5% of the people who had created dashboards with Elasticsearch, etc. So we essentially wanted to kind of give a mechanism by which you can define your own dashboards. You can essentially define your own ways of looking at things. And that is essentially what we are proposing with the new UI. Plus, we essentially are wanting to essentially improve the performance. So now what we are essentially doing is that the phase 2, where we'll have the intermediate architecture, we have agents basically communicating over MQTT to an MQTT server. And then that essentially talks to a backend Kubernetes cluster, which is now talking to Postgres. Now, as part of the intermediate architecture, what is being done is the Postgres is basically then pushing the data into Elasticsearch, so that when we are basically doing the migration of the agents from a user interface perspective or any other functionality perspective, you will not notice any difference. However, your agent basically will be upgraded so that it essentially provides this kind of data. So this is basically the initial phase when we basically will be deploying the agent. So once the agent has been deployed and everything is fine, and we basically determine that all the data is flowing in and everything is okay, what would essentially happen is that the old architecture will be replaced with just the new architecture with MQTT Kubernetes, and you would essentially have this Postgres. And basically, we still talk to Elasticsearch for only one reason, which is right now, the APIs that you're calling essentially call a lot of data within Elasticsearch. And a lot of people have written integrations based on those APIs. We do not want to essentially break those integrations with those APIs, nor do we want to essentially kind of make them immediately do the migration. So we will essentially leave the Elasticsearch system on for quite some time. But since the bulk of the load which comes from the UI will essentially talk directly to Postgres, you will essentially get a huge advantage in terms of performance, as well as the second thing that we are essentially going to be able to do is to kind of expose your database as a SQL interface, which you can essentially query and create your own dashboards and run your own queries on top of. And that is if you're basically like a SQL job. Second is that because of the kind of caching that we've implemented in Postgres, we'll be able to give you much more better performance with this whole thing. So this essentially allows us to give you much more better performance and basically give you additional functionality. Now you would basically ask me what is it there in it for me, right? There are a couple of things that I would like to point out with the new agent that we've essentially kind of created, right? So the other thing which I want to just briefly talk about is basically the migration to what is called a pod-based architecture. Today, when you essentially kind of, based on where you're located, in order to meet locality concerns as well as GDPR concerns and basically make sure that the data is in the area of residency, we essentially have the different regions, and basically we have basically one deployment in each of the regions. Now, one of the problems with this entire concept that we basically noticed was that we essentially were creating areas which were where a large number of partners would be affected basically if any one of those systems fail. So essentially, we went through a little bit of brainstorm to say, how do we essentially reduce the impact and how do we essentially kind of isolate and create systems which are more redundant in nature. And with this, we essentially created what is called this whole pod-based architecture. The pod-based architecture essentially is nothing but a group of services that have been essentially put together. And basically, this is tied down to a certain set of partners. Now, pod, like you see pod 1, pod 2, pod 3. So right now, each pod basically will contain anywhere between 100 to 140 partners. And these blocks of partners will essentially kind of be created. And there can be multiple criteria based on which we create these pods. For example, a particular pod may be a pod where all partners who basically are willing to have experimental updates pushed to them may basically be part of this particular pod, okay? And pods which basically are highly regulated. So customers who, partners who deal with highly regulated customers and do not want us to essentially auto upgrade their agents, all of that could essentially be part of a different pod. So this way, what would happen is that we will be able to push updates and upgrades to certain pods and basically not push it to the other pods and have them basically choose when they want this particular upgrade to basically take place on their sense. So that essentially is what we are doing essentially from the pod-based perspective. Second is that in basically optimizing a lot of this architecture, one of the things that always happens, and I'm being very candid with all of you, which is that when people talk about revenue, the immediate question comes up, which says that how do we raise prices, right? So, of course, these topics keep coming up. And one of the things that I am very strongly opposed to, especially when we are dealing with a lot of uncertainty, is basically kind of increasing prices. So our concept is different. We worked on how can we reduce the cost of basically hosting this solution so that we can essentially give a better experience at a lower cost. And I'm glad to say that basically we've been able to kind of come up with this architecture, and our initial numbers show us that we will essentially get almost like 30 to 35% savings over the old architecture in terms of how much we can essentially per partner, the cost per partner will essentially come down by 30 to 35%. So which means that we can essentially provide you with more functionality without having to essentially kind of go into a price raise regime kind of thing. So that's essentially kind of what we worked on. Now, what are we doing with the whole agent upgrades and why is it important for you? There are two parts. One is basically when we release this new agent, there will be a new service on your systems, which is called the Connect Secure service. So However, your Cyber CNS Agent V2 service will still continue to be there. And the reason for that is that I don't know whether all of you were there at that particular point of time, but we did have one of the times that we released an agent, we did have a fiasco where the agents basically did not communicate back to us and basically did not communicate to the new infrastructure, because of which basically the agents went offline. And then we had a huge problem where a lot of the partners helped us at that point of time by essentially running commands through their RMM and bringing those systems back online. We do not want to essentially repeat that. So the way that the new service will be introduced is that you have this new agent, which is basically called the Connect Secure, which will run along with the current agent, which is Cyber CNS Agent V2. Your agent V2 will basically be in stop state and will be controlled by the daemon that we have, which is essentially called the monitor daemon, right? So it will essentially control this. Now, post migrate, the whole concept is that you will have the control in terms of choosing which of these systems and where you want to be, which companies you want to upgrade to the new Connect Secure agent and which companies you want to keep on the existing agent for a period of time, right? So once we essentially kind of move everyone and everybody, basically we see that the pods are doing well and everybody is happy with the functionality, that's when essentially we'll issue commands to essentially uninstall the Cyber CNS Agent V2 installation, and that will essentially go away. And you will essentially have only the Connect Secure agent that is out there. Now, the new agent has certain differences from what you are experiencing today. Today, you essentially set up, for example, if it's a lightweight agent, you set up basically a schedule. The new lightweight agent is basically what we call as a real-time lightweight agent, because it essentially is sitting on the machine and it's actually listening to changes that are happening on the machine. And what it does is it does not basically post this instantly, because that's one of the problems that we noticed, which is like there can be a lot of changes which are relevant, irrelevant. And then if we keep basically sending this information immediately, one of the things that happens is you will get a lot of inconsistency in terms of what you see. Like you will see suddenly a remediation plan appear and then it disappear, and then people are going to get confused. So what we've essentially done is we've basically taken a 30-minute window. So we essentially bunch all the changes which have happened in the 30 minutes and essentially push it over to the server. But the system itself is in real time. Now, can we reduce the window? We will essentially work with you folks to see how low can that window go to. But this becomes a system where within 30 minutes, we can essentially kind of get all of the changes that have happened in the system and we essentially push it. Now, what is the second advantage that we have out of this? Since we are basically a real-time system and we're observing changes, today your lightweight agent runs, and every time it runs, it basically sends the complete data of the system over there. So what is happening? Your outbound bandwidth is getting used. There is performance issues, all of that stuff, which basically was there with the current agent, disappears with the new agent because we are dealing with only increments. So what are the changes? And we basically track the changes. Third, since we are tracking changes on the system, we have the ability now to essentially give you a complete timeline of the system in terms of what was installed, what was uninstalled, what are the changes that were made. All of this essentially is being recorded on the system. So you can essentially get almost equivalent of a Facebook timeline as we build it when we build for an asset. And you can see what changes were made by whom, when. So that entire piece basically becomes relevant with this. Now, we made a whole bunch of optimization in terms of scan times. So earlier, when you basically gave a /16 network, it would take anywhere between a few hours to a couple of days. Today, we basically are scanning /16 networks under basically 2 hours. We will be able to scan a complete /16 network with all the vulnerabilities and all the upgrades. So that's basically the kind of performance improvement that we made. The number of checks that we are performing against a system. So we were we were essentially performing a close to 24 checks on a system, basically, which could include SSL checks or this checks, all of that check. We have now increased the number of checks that we are doing to 680, almost like going to almost all of the checks that any pen test environment would do. We perform all of those tests. Again, we're going to give you the ability to switch on and switch off what you want us to do and what you don't want to do in the environment. But essentially, these tests are available to you. And last but not the least, we essentially will do a complete demonstration of this system in the second week of June to all of you. And we will basically walk you through the process of how essentially you can upgrade your agent to the new agent, and how will it look like, what is the data, all of those pieces. And in that session, and then we are basically taking the approach of fast is slow and slow is fast on this, so that there is no disturbance to anyone on this particular piece. So as you can see, we continuously keep upgrading what we are doing right now with the current product, but we are basically releasing this. And we hope essentially with the release of this new agent, plus basically the new UI subsequent to the release of this agent, we will be able to kind of meet all of the thoughts that you folks have put into this particular product. And then we will be able to also deliver very quickly on the enhancements that anybody comes up with. So with that, basically, that was the update for this week.
Perfect. Thank you, Shiva. So I think one question from Chris was, will there be UK hosted pods?
Yes.
And I believe yes, the answer to that is yes, because we'll all existing AWS regions will be covered.
Perfect.
Thanks, Chris. Any other questions? Any opinions and any feedback?
Sean, you'll start seeing the new service name. Like, as I said, when in the first week of June, we'll basically kind of make the agent available. Then I'll do a demo. Then you choose essentially that you're going to do the upgrade. Then you will essentially start seeing the service name in your systems. Folks, one more thing which I just forgot to add, but basically was something that a few of you brought up and basically is getting completed tomorrow, is that the backups. So basically we have created a baseline for all backups, basically whether a backup tool is installed on every machine, so that it can basically meet certain compliance requirements. So that is essentially what we are going to do. So will there be service monitoring component for the stopped service? That's already there, Dave. There is basically a watchdog, which basically is there. So this is essentially going to be this thing. Dennis, will there a new reporting platform allow for customization of reports, filtering, sorting, moving, deleting columns? Dennis, I will do the demo in 2 weeks from now. You tell me basically whether it does not meet any of the requirements that you have right now. We have, in fact, all of the feedback that you have given is basically what we have kind of taken and basically built a product requirements document out of. And in fact, a lot of things that you mentioned in terms of basically moving the columns, also basically kind of generating sums of columns, averages, all of those are basically part of this new piece. Chris, is there a capability network diagram? I had a question. We have told them we could do it. They could do. Okay. So Chris, this is not basically, there will be a capability to generate a network diagram, but this is basically not going to be part of the immediate release. But you can quote me that in the in the month of July, you will have this ability with you. Because we are basically implementing a complete scan, which is basically with CDP, LLDP based discovery, plus essentially ARC based discovery, and then basically putting a full network topology on top of it. Dave, the 30-minute frequency is only for pushing data back. So if you look at what we've done with MQTT, MQTT basically allows us to instantaneously start anything that is required. So in fact, that the patch submission process will be much faster. The new probe is capable of doing patching. Sam. Of course, there are requirements for how the probe will do patching, but it will do patching along with the lightweight agent. Yes, Dennis. In fact, my engineers keep reminding me of this particular feature, saying that we promised it and we've not delivered it till date. So in the new one, it will basically have the ability to install. You can essentially choose on a per company basis whether you want to install the lightweight agent or not install the lightweight agent. Sam, autoclose PSA ticket works today. If it's not working, please send us a message to Rishali. We can open a look at it and see. Autoclose is basically a feature that exists today. If you have remediated and we recognize the remediation, then it will autoclose the the ticket. Adam, yes. There is no feature removal. There are only basically feature addition. So yeah, the scan only option will continue to remain there. So perfect. I think there are no more questions. So Srikanth, any last words?
No, I think thanks for all the feedback. The new agent is going to be definitely much more, especially without the concept of a scheduled scan, more real time. So a lot of interesting things coming up. Keep the feedback coming, and thanks for your time. Appreciate it. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.